Welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. Today, Roxanne is going to be sharing her second birth story, the birth of her son, Colin, which was at a birth center in California. Welcome to the MamasteFit podcast. This is Gina, perinatal fitness trainer and birth doula.
And this is Roxanne, labor and delivery nurse and student midwife.
And this is the MamasteFit podcast, where we empower you on your prenatal fitness, birth, and postpartum return to fitness journey.
Our podcast shares how to move throughout your pregnancy to stay strong and comfortable. Pain is not a requirement of pregnancy. Understand the science of birth and how to approach recovery after birth.
We share our personal experiences as mothers navigating the stage of lives, plus our professional expertise as birth workers and fitness professionals.
Our goal is to help you feel confident as you navigate the perinatal timeframe for an empowering pregnancy, positive birth, and postpartum journey.
We are glad to have you with us on this journey and that you've chosen us to support you.
So today we're going to discuss the birth of my second child, my son, Colin. So we got pregnant like around 17, 18 months after the birth of our first child, Lily. And we knew that there was going to be some major life stressors coming up during it because we knew my husband was going to have to move at some point. We didn't know exactly when it was going to be, but that also unknown was a little bit stressful. But thankfully, the first 12 weeks of our pregnancy was pretty uneventful other than like the normal pregnancy first trimester fatigue and nausea. But then around 12 weeks, when most people are like, oh, like you're out of the woods, because that's like the end of the first trimester, the risk of miscarriage decreases greatly after 12 weeks. We were on our way to take Lily to a swim lesson, and my mom was with me. She just happened to come with me that week. She was like, yeah, I'll like drive up with you because it's about an hour drive from where we live. And we were on the phone with my brother, and I just felt, so everyone who has a period probably knows like that feeling that you get when your period starts, like when like the first like trickle of blood comes out. And I felt that while we were driving, and I was like, that's weird. And then like I remember I reached down because that's like our intuition, like, oh, I think like fluid's coming out of my body, let me like touch it while driving. So I reached down and I pull my hand up. We're on the phone with my brother. My mom is sitting next to me and I'm like, Mom, I'm bleeding. My mom, love her, but she does not react well in stressful situations. She just starts screaming, oh no, Roxanne's bleeding. Oh, we need to go, goodbye. And just hangs up on my brother. And then she's like, what are we gonna do? And I was like, Mom, let's take a breath. Because I was 12 weeks pregnant, so like I obviously know that there's nothing that they could really do at that point. So we were like probably 5 minutes from a hospital in Raleigh, but I was like, there's no point to go to this place that I don't know. I don't seek care there. So we turned around and drove the 30 minutes to the hospital that I normally go to. This was also beginning COVID. Not beginning COVID, but like still COVID-ish, where like no one could come into the ER with you. So this was like not November. I can't remember when it was, but no one could go into the emergency room with you. So my mom drops me off and takes my daughter home, and I go into the ER by myself, just like towel between my legs. It was like soaking through my pants. And of course, I did not wear black pants that day. Of course, I was wearing like gray pants where like you could clearly see blood on the pants. So I like walk in with my daughter's pool, like swimming towel, which is like pink fong, baby shark. And I was like, I'm pregnant and I'm bleeding. And then I had to sit in the ER for like hours because that's just what happens when you go to the emergency room. My husband drove to like be able to take me home and brought me new clothes to change into. And he just had to wait in the parking lot for this entire time. So it was also stressful for him because I also didn't have the greatest phone service in the emergency room. But I remember like going in there expecting the worst news because the amount of blood that was like coming out of my body, I was like, there's no way that this baby is doing well in there. So they take me to the ultrasound, and if anybody who has had like any sort of like early loss or like had any vaginal bleeding early in pregnancy, you know that when you go to ultrasound, the tech cannot tell you anything because they're not a radiologist. So, like they cannot like diagnose anything. So they can't tell you anything that they see, even though they definitely know what they're seeing, they can't tell you anything. And that is so annoying for someone who is 12 weeks pregnant, has copious amounts of bleeding coming out. They can't tell you if your baby has a heartbeat or not. So the ultrasound lady is doing her thing, very quiet, not saying anything. She like turns the screen away from me, and I just start bawling because I was like, if there was a heartbeat, she would be not as stoic and like straight faced as she is. So I just start bawling, and she just like puts her hand on me to like console me while she's doing the ultrasound, which I did appreciate a lot. But afterwards, I remember she like put a warm blanket on me, and she's like, I can't tell you this, so don't tell anyone, but baby does have a heartbeat. And I was like, thank you. I appreciate that so much. And so then I went back to my emergency room. And thankfully she told me this, because all of the doctors that came into the emergency room, nobody mentioned anything. They just started talking about like what the bleeding was and blah, blah, blah. No one wants to tell me that baby had a heartbeat. If the ultrasound tech didn't tell me that baby had a heartbeat, I would still be like super upset right now and like confused and crying. But then I think it was like the fourth doctor that came in was like, did anyone tell you that your baby still has a heartbeat and like what's going on? And I was like, no, thank you for telling me though. I appreciate that. And so he apologized. Obviously we know now Colin had what was called a subchorionic hemorrhage. They sometimes will say like a bruise. So it was bleeding between the placenta where it attached to the uterine wall was just a bruise. They say they're very common during pregnancies, or not very common, but like they usually occur. Some people bleed, some people don't bleed. And most of them will resolve on their own. Sometimes they don't resolve if they're very large, and it will lead to a miscarriage, or it could lead to long-term complications associated with the pregnancy with growth restriction for a baby, could increase your risks of developing hypertension during your pregnancy. And so during my pregnancy, I still had a copious amount of bleeding for probably the next couple of weeks, and it didn't really subside until I was closer to like 16, 17 weeks. So it was like a long period of time where I would just like bleed randomly, which was really exciting. But then at 20 weeks, my bleeding had like stopped. And then when they did an ultrasound, the subchorionic hemorrhage had disappeared, which is if it didn't disappear by 20 weeks, then I was at a higher risk of it leading to long-term complications with my pregnancy. But it resolved by 20 weeks. And so for the past 20 weeks, I hadn't really been working out much. I just like would go on like short walks, do like body weight movement if I was feeling good, but otherwise like not really doing a lot of exercise. So once I was cleared, I got back into working out, which was really great. And then around 30 weeks, I did a growth ultrasound just to make sure that the subchorionic hemorrhage didn't affect his growth, and he was measuring right on track. So everything thankfully worked out with that.
Let's take a break from this week's episode to hear from one of our sponsors, Needed, a nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment for the perinatal journey. We need choline to support our baby's neural tube formation and cognitive development, as well as for our own health benefits. But many of us are not getting enough choline in our diets, and most prenatals include only a bare minimum amount or none at all. New research also suggests that we need double of the current recommendations. That's one of the reasons I love Needed so much. Needed's core products contain choline, plus they have a choline add-on. I highly recommend adding Needed's choline onto any prenatal vitamin you are taking. To get started, head to thisisneeded.com and use code MamastePod for 20% off your first order or first 3 months of a Needed subscription.
With our pregnancy though, so we were scheduled to move across the country. So that was really stressful to move from North Carolina to California, and knowing that I was going to be like 32 weeks pregnant when we did it. Originally, we were just going to deliver at the hospital that was going to be in the area. But then I remembered that birth centers are a lot more common in California, a lot easier to find because certified professional midwives are licensed in California. So they're the ones who normally will run the birth centers, the freestanding birth centers. So I just Googled Monterey birth centers, and there's literally a Monterey birth and wellness center. So it ended up being like 7 minutes from the house that we were going to rent. It was kind of just like timed perfectly and worked out perfectly that they were really close in the area, and they had room for me in their schedule, even though I reached out like kind of later in my pregnancy. So I started doing like virtual appointments with them while still doing my in-person in North Carolina until we moved. And then I started obviously doing my in-person once we arrived in California. But it was nice to kind of develop a relationship with the wifeys before I got there. And then it was a little bit less stressful, like meeting them for the first time in person, because I had already had one appointment with each wifey prior to getting there. So we moved across the country at 32 weeks and actually arrived there, I think, when I was around 34 weeks pregnant our household goods, like all of our home goods and belongings arrived thankfully pretty quickly. And we unpacked them as quickly as possible and tried to get settled in. Gina and my mom arrived in Monterey when I was around 38 weeks. And then it was just the waiting game to wait for me to go into labor. It was a vacation for Gina. It was a little bit of work to support me during birth, but it was mostly a vacation for Gina because she did go to Disneyland while she was visiting me. We also knew like I was 40-2 with Lily when I went into labor. Gina was 41-3 with Adeline and then 40-1 with Owen. Did not think I was going to have my baby when she was at Disneyland at all. But I always joke like, oh, I'm going to text her and be like, oh, I'm in labor. Have fun driving back the 5 hours from Disneyland.
So it was definitely a conversation that we had together about whether or not we should go. We had, again, grand visions that we would have our babies early, and we don't. And so Roxanne was nearing her due date. My husband was out in California with us, and he happened to have like a block of time off from work to where he can come be with us. The question was he just going to take our 2 children down to Disneyland by himself, or were we going to take all 3 kids? So both of my children and then Roxanne's daughter, Lily. And so we all kind of had a conversation on like, when should we go? Like, should we go now or should we wait? But we were kind of coming to the end of his time there. And so we all decided that we should take all the kids to Disneyland and then just let Roxanne and Patrick, Roxanne's husband, just spend time together after this huge move across the country so that they can just kind of decompress before the new baby came. And it worked out. We all had a great time. It was Lily's like first vacation away from her family. She only pooped in her diaper like once. That was a little traumatic for us. They have a splash pad at the hotel we like to play at or stay at when we go to Disneyland. And we were like, Lily, do you gotta poop? And she was like, nope. And then sure enough, we see her like in the water, like grunting and pushing. And I don't know if you've ever changed a swim diaper with poop in it, but it is like chlorine does something to fecal matter. And it was atrocious. Oh my God. So a little traumatized from that. But otherwise a great vacation. And we did make it back in time for Colin's birth.
They did. I always joke that Gina took a vacation to California and I just happened to go into labor at the same time. So they were there for like 2 or 3 days and then they got back on June 27th. So the next day was my sister's daughter, so Gina's oldest daughter, Adeline's birthday, June 28th, which was also my original due date. Somehow my due date was changed to June 30th, but June 28th was my original due date. And I remembered early on in my pregnancy, I had asked Adeline, hey, do you want to share a birthday with baby Colin? And she's like, no. Absolutely not. And I was like, cool. So then on June 27th, they had got back from Disneyland and they were cooking dinner. And I remember like my back was like kind of achy. So I took like a bath and like kind of went to bed a little bit early. Before I went to bed, I remember asking Adeline, because I just had like a feeling that potentially I was going to have this baby tomorrow. So I remember asking her, I was like, would you want to share a birthday with baby Colin, your baby cousin? And she was like, absolutely. We could have the biggest birthday party with 2 cakes, 2 bounce houses. Like it would be amazing. So I was like, cool. She gives me permission. And then I go to bed and wake up around like, similar with my daughter, I woke up around like 3 a.m., I feel like, with contractions. But I did not do what I did the previous time where I like got up and started walking around my house. I just put on the TENS unit and tried to fall back to sleep. I think I maybe slept for another hour and then woke up and I was like, okay, now I need to like wake up my husband because this is the real deal. So he started doing like hip squeezes around 4 a.m. He's like, it would have been really nice if you would have told me that you thought you were going to go into labor or you were feeling contractions last night because I would not have stayed up till 1 a.m. with the Baron. And I'm like, labor is unpredictable. Now is not the time to discuss this. But so it's like 4 a.m. He's applying hip squeezes. I think I texted Gina at this time, but she did not respond because she was also sleeping. And I was like, there's no reason to wake her up.
This is a trend with Roxanne because her first birth, she also texted me and I did not respond because I was also sleeping.
Gina doesn't put on alerts of my text messages.
This is why I just call Roxanne whenever I'm in labor at 5 a.m.
But I was considerate. I was like, well, I'm definitely got a while. Like with Lily, I had like friggin' 30 hours of early labor. So I was like, It's just starting. So it's like 5 a.m. and I think Gina woke up to see my text message. So she like came into the room, like helped me like get situated with like her heating pad and stuff because I started feeling my contractions a little bit in my lower belly. And my brother-in-law was still there. So Barron was still there. And we're like, hey, Barron, do you think that you would want to stay here with all the kids and my mom could come to the birth? And he's like, yeah, I could do that. Because originally my mom was coming to be able to watch the kids while we all went to the birth. Like Gina and my husband and I went to the birth. She was going to watch the kids, but Barron was there. So it kind of worked out that she was able to come to the birth again because she was there for my first. So this is after we texted the wifeys to make sure it was okay that my mom came and to also let them know that I was contracting. And I think my husband ended up calling them around 7 to say like that was when I wanted to come into the birth center because I started feeling the contractions just a little bit more. I didn't think it was really time. I honestly didn't believe that I was going to have the baby that day. I'm going to be in labor forever, just like the first one. I really didn't want to go to the birth center, but Gina's like, you should probably just take advantage of the room. It's like has a really nice tub. It's a nice ambiance. We should just go there and like one will either just send you home and it's a 7-minute drive or like you have your baby today. And I was like, fine, let's do it. Because I don't really think I want to get into the car later. I remember what it was like with Lily being in transition and in the car. So we'll just go now. It's not too bad. But in that like 5 minutes that we decided to go to the birth center, things picked up. The contractions were like way more intense. So thankfully we decided to go to the birth center. I think we got to the birth center like 7:30 and I immediately got into the tub because that was like the one thing. I remember when I looked at the birth center online, I saw the beautiful birthing tub and I was like, I want to deliver here because that tub looks amazing and I want to deliver my baby in that tub. So I got to use the tub and it was as amazing as I thought it was. I have a lot of back labor with my first and then obviously I just think I labor in my back, which is unfortunate. But thankfully, my mom is really good at back massages as well as Gina. My husband could use a little bit of improvement, but he does a good job still. He's just not as good as my mom. As we all think, our mom's cooking is always better than anybody else's cooking, even though it might honestly be better. But side story. So we get to the birth center around 7:30 and I just like labor in the tub, labor in the shower for a bit, just like to like get up and move around because you don't want to stay in one spot for too long. And then with my daughter, I mostly only had contractions in my back. I didn't really have a ton in my belly. But with Colin, I felt the contractions in my back, but also in my lower belly. And for some reason, that just convinced me that something was wrong. Like maybe he was in a funky position or something. Like I was just convinced that something was wrong. And that's why I was having a different labor. It's probably just how I labored the second time. Because Gina labored the same way where she had a lot of pain in her lower belly. And she's like, that's just how people labor, Roxanne. And I'm like, no, something's wrong. We should do some inversions. She was like, okay, we can do that. She supported me in my decision. So we did a few inversions. I remember my midwife coming in and she being like, was there any like clue to why you decided to do inversions? She's like, I'm just curious if like you're concerned about baby's position. And I was like, I don't know, this just feels different than the first one. And she's like, okay, sounds good. And then like listened to baby and then said, let me know. And I'm like, okay. So after the inversions, I did some lunges on the bed and then decided to get back into the tub. I don't even know what time this was.
You did a little bit in the shower.
Yeah, I was in the shower and then like
Then you made it back to the tub. And at this point, we had been at the birth center for about 3 hours.
Yeah, so it's probably like 10:30.
And so I jokingly tell Roxanne, like, hey, Rox, like, we've made it to our 3-hour active labor time point. It's time to start pushing. Like, haha. And then the next contraction, she started bearing down. And so now I'll joke with my clients and I'll be like, yeah, you know, whenever I tell you it's time to push, you will. Because I think it happened like 2 or 3 more times. And so
Psychic
I'm like,
Gina.
so anyway, so I tell Roxanne, hey, it's time to start pushing. And the next contraction, she started bearing down.
But with the bearing downs, it didn't, like I was pushing, but it just felt wrong. It's like hard to describe, but it like just didn't feel, like I remember what pushing was like with my daughter and it, like the pushing that I was doing didn't feel the same. But like Gina called out, like midwives came in and I remember the one was like, hey, how you doing? And I was just like, this just feels different. And they're like, well, can you feel the baby's head or anything like that, or the bag of water? So I like tried to check myself, and I was like, it doesn't feel like what I would expect it to be. Like, I feel like the baby's still very high. And so I had asked them if they could just check. So my one midwife checked me, and she's like, so you do have a little bit of an anterior lip. She's like, but it's very stretchy. And I was like, that's probably what I was feeling, was like the pinching and kind of pulling of the anterior lip still being there. So when I would bear down, it would kind of cramp a little bit more, because that's what, like, when you stimulate the cervix, it can cause more cramping. So it felt like just a weird sensation, not necessarily pinching per se, but it just felt like it didn't feel as purposeful as it did when I had it with my daughter. So I remember the one wifey recommended standing up out of the tub, because I had been in the tub for probably like 30 minutes at this point, but like standing up would allow gravity to help Colin to descend a little bit more. And she's like, just stand up and you can push for like 1 or 2 contractions. And as soon as your water breaks, you can get back in the tub. Like, so if he starts delivering, you can just get back into the tub. You just have to sit back down. And I was like, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to get out of the tub. This is very comfortable, and it's not comfortable when I get out. And they're like, just do it for 1 or 2 contractions. So I was like, okay. So my husband helps like lift me like to standing in the tub. And I remember like leaning over him like in between the contractions. And then I don't remember if I pushed for 1 or 2 contractions, but during one of them, my water does break everywhere. And I immediately sit down, and I can feel him just like coming through. So standing up was really beneficial. It probably allowed Colin to come put more pressure that caused the amniotic sac to actually break, so that he could fully reduce the anterior lip that I had. Once my water broke, I think it was like 1 more contraction, and then Colin came out. I was able to actually pull him up out of the water, which was super cool. I do remember that I was very focused, because I was like, I don't want to fuck this up. Because I mean, in my mind, you're like, I mean, your baby's in water. You don't want to like mess it up, or like they're slippery and water is slippery. So like you don't want to like let go of them as you're like pulling them out of the water. So I remember being very mindful as he's like crowning. People always say like water birth. Oh, it's like, oh, it like helps reduce the pain, water birth. It's still painful. Okay. People like told me, they're like, oh, water birth was amazing. Like, I didn't feel like the burning sensation at all. They're full of it. I still felt the burning, but I will say it definitely was not as bad as with Lily, but I don't know if it was necessarily the water or the fact that Lily crowned for 15 minutes and Colin crowned for like 10 seconds. But I do remember there was still burning, and I remember thinking they lied to me. But the burning again lasted for like 10 seconds. His head came out, and then I was able to like push out his little shoulders to pull him up to my chest and like hold him. He was like wrapped in his umbilical cord, so my midwife had to like unwrap him and then hand him back to me. And I love to watch the video, because I think everybody envisions the first thing that they'd say to their baby, and it'd be like this beautiful kind of like moment. And I'm just like, hi, hi, hi. And I'm like, oh, why was that the first thing that I said to him? Just hi, like 47 times in a row. And then I said he looked just like his sister, because he did. He did really look just so much like her. The thing that I'm always worried about, like whenever I have babies too, is that my babies are going to be huge. My daughter was 8 pounds, 3 ounces, and my son ended up being smaller. So that's probably why my pushing phase was a little bit shorter with him. He was only 7 pounds, 7 ounces, but he still just looked so chunky and adorable when he was born, just like his sister. But I could tell that he was definitely smaller. I do remember looking at my husband and again, wiping up a tear. And I'm like, yes, success. I did it again. He's moved. But it was really just kind of amazing to have delivered in the tub. And I just remember being like feeling so supported by everybody in the room. Delivering my daughter was just a little bit different. I wasn't in the hospital for very long, and it was kind of like a little bit of a stressful transition from bearing down in the car to then getting up to the hospital. So I was probably actually on labor and delivery in labor for like an hour. Whereas at the birth center, I was there for like 4 hours probably total in labor. They would only come in to kind of listen to the baby. If I needed anything, they would come in and help. But they didn't check me when I got there. They just believed that I was in labor. They believed like my intuition and trusted me that I knew my body and knew when I was in labor. So they didn't feel that they needed to check me when I got there. They literally wouldn't have checked my cervix at all unless I did ask for it. So like if I had never asked for that one cervical check while I was pushing, they would have never checked my cervix. They would have just trusted my body, which was really different than what I experienced in hospitals, where like if someone starts bearing down, they're always like, oh, well, you have to make sure the cervix is all the way gone, because like this risk of cervical laceration is like a very big deal. But if someone's in like normal physiologic birth, like the idea that if someone starts to bear down spontaneously, like their cervix is probably fully dilated and they're probably going to have a baby. You probably don't need to check their cervix. So that was just a really cool experience and kind of really sparked my want to kind of be a little bit more involved in out of hospital birth. I felt really fortunate that my mom could be there again, and obviously that Gina was there. They made it back from Disney to be there for the birth. And then my husband was really supportive, obviously, but he was really helpful during the birth center decision to like deliver in an out of hospital birth. He was very supportive of that, but he also was like, it was a really cool experience to deliver at a place that wasn't like a hospital. So I loved my birth with Colin. I felt so badass to deliver my own baby. Not many people can say that. They pulled, like I delivered him. Obviously I delivered him, but like I caught him too and like actually was the first one to hold him and like bring him into the world, which was really not something that I ever thought I would want, but now I want it for every baby and I want it for everybody. Like I really want everybody to deliver their own baby.
So I wanted it for myself after witnessing super serene Roxanne pull her beautiful baby directly up to her chest, and I was like, yes, that will be me. And so for you'll hear my birth story in 2 weeks, but I was like, that will be me. It was not me. So not everyone can catch their own baby, because for some of us pushing is a little overwhelming. Yes. But set me up for false expectations.
Expectation management for birth is very helpful. Gina and I labor very similarly, but also birth very differently. But Gina is also a more vocal person, and I'm definitely more stoic and internal. I internalize all of my emotions. So internally, I was freaking out while pushing my baby out, but Gina externally showed her
the serene
emotions.
Birthing goddess. And then you watch my video and I'm just like, ah!
Yeah. We have actually shown people both of our pushing, because I got a video of Gina pushing Sophie out, and it is funny to compare the two. But yeah, that's my birth story with Colin. And I mean, postpartum I would do birth over and over. Postpartum is so hard, but like my postpartum support with Colin from like my midwives was amazing. Like the wifeys, we saw them so often that it was so helpful for me to just like have another adult to talk to about anything other than like poopy diapers. Because my mom had left when I was like 3 weeks postpartum. Gina left when I was like 1 week postpartum, which was a big difference between Lily and Colin, was that I didn't have like my family support. So I was thankfully able to have the support from the wifeys for those first like couple weeks, which was so beneficial and so helpful for me. Like if you are at low risk pregnancy and you have the option of an out of hospital birth and home birth doesn't interest you, a birth center, like a freestanding birth center is like, I feel like the perfect in between, which we can do an entire episode on that. But I just feel so grateful that I was able to have that experience and be able to kind of feel just very empowered and supported again in my birth with my second.
So I think it's important to define freestanding birth center versus what like a lot of hospitals will call their labor floors birth centers. And so like I'll even have my own doula clients be like really confused where they'll say, hey, I want to deliver in this birth center, and it's actually a hospital. And so a freestanding birth center is not in a hospital. Sometimes they have some connection to other local hospitals, but I'll let Roxanne talk more on kind of the difference between the two and like what she would have done if she needed to transfer her care or if her birth center didn't have enough, and kind of the norm of what a birth center may offer versus like special things that hers had that others may not normally.
So most birth centers will have, like a freestanding birth center should have like some relationship with a hospital nearby. So our birth center had a relationship with a hospital that was about, I think it was like a 20 or 30 minute drive. So if I needed to transfer for any reason, and they're always going to transfer before there's an emergency, because that is obviously what is preferred. So there are like pink flags that alert the wifeys that this birth needs to transfer. Like it is no longer safe to deliver in a freestanding birth center. In an out out of hospital setting, transferring to a hospital is a better and a safer option at this time. So I thankfully didn't have any of those, but when they do happen, like it is a discussion. They're not going to like force you to go to the hospital unless it is like a true emergency, but they do like list off the risks and benefits, and then you kind of decide for yourself. And then you can either drive yourself there or take an ambulance. The reason we chose this freestanding birth center was because they had the ability to provide resuscitation for baby. And then they, like most birth centers, will have resuscitation, like emergency medications for mom if there's like heavy bleeding or anything that, like if they needed to place an IV, if they were GBS positive, they could place the IV for the medicine. They can give you IV fluids if you're dehydrated. But the one thing that my birth center had was they had a infant warmer that had the capabilities to provide CPAP, which is continuous pressure, like continuous positive airway pressure, to kind of help baby's airway open. So it's called PPV, positive pressure ventilation, because most babies, when they come out, if they need some sort of resuscitation or assistance after birth, most of them just need a little bit of oxygen and then they're fine. So the fact that this birth center had the capabilities to provide that was really reassuring to me. I know as a birth worker that is what most babies just need. A little bit of oxygen and then they're good to go. So not every birth center will have like the full setup, like the infant warmer that mine had. So that is a good question to ask. But it's just like a happy medium between delivering in a hospital where there's like a ton of interventions that they could do. So like they couldn't do like forceps or vacuums in a birth center like they can in a hospital. But they can do a lot of other interventions that they couldn't do at home. Kind of the perfect in between for a lot of people if that is an option available to you. So here in North Carolina, it is not an option for us because the closest one prior to its closing was an hour and a half away from where we live. Not reasonable for me to drive. Some people have done it and they've loved it. An hour and a half in a car is just a little bit too long for me. But that birth center also has closed. So it's now no longer an option unless I wanted to drive 2 hours, which is not reasonable for people. So birth centers in other states, it's harder to find. Home birth midwives, surprisingly, are a little bit easier to find in some places than finding a freestanding birth center. So there is an accreditation process that some freestanding birth centers get, and it's through the American Association of Birth Centers, so AABC. That is one place that you can go to find accredited birth centers. That just means that they follow certain protocols and have certain policies in place before they can like operate, and then they get like accredited again occasionally. I can't remember how often, but it's like every few years they have to resubmit all of this paperwork to be reaccredited. So there are benefits to being accredited. For one, like, you know, they're going to have like a standard of care. So maybe potentially operating in a safer manner, maybe a non-accredited one. But the benefit is also that a lot of insurance companies will not cover birth center births unless they are accredited by AABC. So they have a directory on their website, and that's one of the things that I use to find the birth centers is going through the website, and they have like a list. So all you have to do is put in like your location, and all of the birth centers in that area will come up, which makes it a little bit easier. Not to say that like unaccredited birth centers are not a great option. Like Google is always an option to find birth centers in your area, but then going to those birth centers, doing a tour, asking their questions. So some of the questions that I asked when I was interviewing them was, what type of resuscitation levels do they have? Like, do they have oxygen? What type of medications if I started to bleed? Because I do bleed heavily after birth. It's not technically like postpartum hemorrhage level, but I definitely do bleed a lot more after births. With my first, I passed out. So I don't think we mentioned that in my birth story, but I passed out after my birth when I went to the bathroom. And so that was a concern for me for my second one, that I might bleed too much and pass out. With other questions that I asked was like, how long do they stay? And then what are their transfer policies? Because they should have transfer policies in place to find when are they going to transfer you? Like if you have meconium in your fluid, do they automatically transfer you? Like when after your water has broke, would they transfer you? So all of those types of questions are great to ask. And then the last one was, would they transfer with me to the hospital if I had to transfer to the hospital? And this was like a year after COVID, so they would not transfer with me. But in the past, they had gone to the hospital with clients, so that could still be a thing at other birth centers. So those are good questions to ask. And then doing the tour and getting to know the midwives and like the providers at that birth center is also beneficial because not everyone is going to jive with everybody's personalities. So like having a birth center where there's lots of different personalities, like you might get along with all of them or different ones. So I loved all of the wifeys that I had met, and I was glad that all of the ones that were there at my birth were there. But there are other birth centers in that area that maybe were different personalities that I would not have really wanted at my birth. So picking your provider at your birth center is one of the benefits, is that you can get to know them prior to decide if they are the ones that you want to deliver you. Similar with home birth, like you pick the provider, like you get to pick like the exact midwife that's going to be at your birth, which can be a benefit. So it's just important to know that you have options. Like a lot of people forget that you don't have to deliver at a hospital. You can deliver in a freestanding birth center if that's an option for you, or you can deliver at home with a midwife. So wherever you choose to have your babies, just knowing that you have options, like you don't have to necessarily choose. That's not your only option. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow our podcast on whatever platform that you listen to us on. We release new episodes every Wednesday, and we hope to see you next week.
The MamasteFit podcast is sponsored by Needed, a nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment for your perinatal journey. Use code MamasteFitPod for 20% off your first order.